On my 65th birthday, I gave my grandson a DNA test. My daughter-in-law nearly collapsed when she saw the box in his hands. For a second, the entire dining room went silent. Even the soft jazz music playing from the kitchen speaker suddenly felt too loud. My grandson Tyler looked up at me with confusion, turning the small blue package over in his hands while my daughter-in-law Vanessa gripped the edge of the table so tightly I thought her wine glass might shatter. "What is this supposed to mean?" she asked, her voice thin and strained. I smiled gently and adjusted the silver napkin in my lap. "It's just a family ancestry kit, sweetheart," I said softly. "People love learning where they come from these days." My son Daniel let out a nervous laugh. "Mom, you're really getting into these online trends now, huh?" But he couldn't meet my eyes when he said it. Vanessa still looked frozen, pale, terrified. And in that moment, I knew something I had suspected for nearly 2 years. She had been afraid of this day for a very long time. "I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end. And tell me what city you're watching from. Sometimes the truth hiding inside a family can destroy everything people spent years pretending was perfect." The dining room glowed warmly beneath the chandelier Daniel installed last Christmas. The long oak table was decorated with white candles, gold ribbon, and a bouquet of pale roses Tyler had helped pick out that afternoon. From the outside, we probably looked like one of those happy suburban families people post online during the holidays. A successful son. A beautiful daughter-in-law. A smart grandson with perfect grades and expensive sneakers. And me, the aging mother sitting quietly at the end of the table trying not to notice how little space she occupied in their lives anymore. Vanessa stood abruptly and reached for the wine bottle with shaky hands. "I think everyone's overreacting," she said quickly. "It's just a silly DNA kit." Tyler laughed. "Actually, this is cool, Grandma. My friend Josh did one and found out he was like 12% Scottish." Vanessa's smile twitched so slightly most people would have missed it. I didn't. Over the years, I had learned to notice the tiny things. The pauses. The glances. The fear people try to bury underneath polite smiles. Especially inside families. Daniel cleared his throat and reached for the mashed potatoes. "So, Mom," he said carefully, "where did this idea even come from?" I looked at my son for a long moment. At 42, he still had the same brown eyes he'd had as a little boy. The same gentle expression. The same trusting nature that used to make me proud when he was young. Now it only made me worried. "Oh," I said quietly, folding my hands together. "I suppose I've just been thinking a lot lately about family history." Vanessa dropped her fork. The sharp clatter echoed across the room. Tyler jumped slightly. "You okay, Mom?" he asked. "Fine," she answered too quickly. "Just tired." But she wasn't tired. She was scared. And as I watched my daughter-in-law struggle to steady her breathing across my birthday table, I realized something strange. For the first time in years, I wasn't the one feeling powerless anymore. That dinner ended earlier than usual. Vanessa claimed she had a migraine and disappeared upstairs before we even cut the birthday cake. Tyler looked disappointed, though he tried not to show it. At 16, he was old enough to notice tension, but still young enough to believe adults could hide the truth if they smiled hard enough. Daniel walked me to the front door around 9:30. The October air felt cold against my cheeks as I slipped on my coat. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked, and porch lights glowed softly across our quiet suburban neighborhood. "Thanks for coming, Mom," Daniel said awkwardly. I almost laughed at that. As if I were a guest. As if I hadn't spent 30 years raising him mostly by myself after his father died from a heart attack at 52. I pulled my gloves tighter instead. "It was a lovely evening," I said quietly. Daniel shoved his hands into his pockets, avoiding my eyes again. "You know Vanessa gets anxious about stuff sometimes," he muttered. "She probably thought the DNA thing was weird." Weird. I looked at my son standing under the porch light, his hair beginning to gray at the temples now. For a moment, I saw the little boy who used to run into my bedroom after nightmares, clutching his blanket and asking if monsters were real. Back then, I always knew how to protect him. Now I wasn't so sure. I didn't mean any harm, I said softly. It was just a gift. Daniel nodded too quickly. Right, of course. But his voice sounded uncertain. As I drove home through the quiet streets of Maplewood, my chest felt heavy in a way I couldn't explain. Not because of Vanessa's reaction. Because deep down, I already knew what it meant. The signs had been there for years. I just didn't want to see them. My small house felt colder than usual when I stepped inside. I turned on the kitchen light and stood there for a moment listening to the silence settle around me. 3 years ago, after Harold died, the silence used to feel peaceful. Now it felt permanent. I poured myself a cup of chamomile tea and sat by the window overlooking the backyard. The oak tree Harold planted when Daniel was born had already started shedding leaves across the grass. Everything gets older quietly. Families do too. At first, I told myself Vanessa simply wanted space after marrying Daniel. Young couples needed privacy, independence, their own traditions. But little things started adding up. Birthday parties I heard about afterward on Facebook. School events Tyler forgot to mention because Vanessa said they were too hectic for me. Christmas dinners moved to her sister's house every year. Photos where everyone stood close together while I somehow always ended up near the edge. Like a distant relative instead of Daniel's mother. The worst part wasn't the exclusion itself. It was how polite she made it sound. Vanessa never raised her voice. Never insulted me directly. She just slowly rearranged the family until I no longer fit naturally inside it. And Daniel let it happen. I stared down into my tea. Cold now. Untouched. Then my phone buzzed softly against the kitchen table. A text message from Vanessa. Please don't say anything else to Tyler about DNA tests. You embarrassed everyone tonight. I read the message twice. Not, why would you do that? Not, what are you implying? Just, don't say anything else. As if she already knew exactly why I had done it. And for the first time in nearly 2 years, the terrible suspicion I'd been trying to bury no longer felt impossible. It felt real. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Vanessa's face at the dinner table. Pale. Frozen. Afraid. Not offended. Not confused. Afraid. By 6 in the morning, I was already sitting in my kitchen wearing Harold's old gray cardigan and staring at the rain sliding down the window above the sink. The coffee maker hummed softly beside me, filling the room with the familiar smell Harold used to love on Sunday mornings. I used to think grief was the hardest thing a woman could survive. I was beginning to realize betrayal was worse. Because grief comes from losing someone. Betrayal comes from discovering who they really were all along. Around 8, my phone rang. Daniel. For a moment, my heart lifted. Maybe he wanted to talk honestly. Maybe he'd noticed Vanessa's behavior too. But the second I answered, I could hear tension in his voice. Mom, he said carefully, Vanessa's pretty upset. I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug. I figured. She thinks the DNA gift crossed a line. There was a pause. A long one. Then he added quietly, honestly, I kind of do too. That hurt more than I expected. Not because he disagreed with me. Because of how quickly he defended her. Even now. Even after last night. I didn't accuse anyone of anything. I said softly, it was just a genealogy kit. Daniel sighed heavily. You know how sensitive Vanessa is. Sensitive. That word again. Vanessa was always sensitive whenever questions got too close to the truth. I stared out the kitchen window at the wet backyard grass. Daniel, I asked quietly, have you ever noticed Tyler doesn't look much like you? The silence on the other end became immediate. Sharp. Dangerous. What kind of question is that? A simple one. Mom? His voice dropped lower now. Warning me. I don't know what's going on with you lately, but I need you to stop. I closed my eyes. There it was again. That same feeling I'd had for years whenever Vanessa was involved. Like everyone expected me to apologize for noticing things. I'm not trying to hurt anyone, I whispered. Daniel exhaled slowly. Well, you are. Then he ended the call. Just like that. I sat there holding the phone long after the screen went dark. 20 years ago, Daniel used to call me every Sunday evening without fail. He'd tell me about work, ask for advice, complain about bills or traffic or dating. After he married Vanessa, those calls slowly disappeared. At first, she'd answer his phone for him. Then she started explaining why they were so busy lately. Eventually, weeks would pass between conversations. And somehow, every time I felt hurt by it, I convinced myself I was overreacting. But mothers notice patterns, even when they wish they didn't. Around noon, I drove to the grocery store for a few things I didn't really need. The rain had stopped, leaving the parking lot slick and silver beneath the cloudy sky. As I reached for a shopping cart, I heard someone call my name. Margaret? I turned and saw Denise Parker walking toward me. Tyler's old pediatric nurse. I hadn't seen her in years. She smiled warmly at first, but the expression faded the second she looked closely at my face. You okay, honey? She asked gently. I forced a small smile. Just tired. Denise hesitated. Then she said something that made my stomach tighten instantly. I almost said hello to Vanessa and Tyler at the clinic last month. She said, but they left so fast after seeing the specialist. I didn't get the chance. I frowned slightly. Specialist? Denise's expression shifted immediately. Like she realized she'd said too much. Oh, she said quickly, maybe I misunderstood. But it was already too late. Because suddenly, every terrible thought I'd spent 2 years trying to bury came rushing back stronger than ever. I stood there beside the shopping carts pretending to look for my car keys while Denise awkwardly adjusted the strap of her purse. The air between us suddenly felt uncomfortable. Too careful. Too quiet. What specialist? I asked again, keeping my voice calm. Denise glanced toward the grocery store entrance like she wanted an escape route. Oh, it was probably nothing, she said quickly. I only saw them for a second. But people only say, probably nothing, when they know it's something. I forced a polite smile. Denise, I said softly, I'm 65 years old. Not fragile. Her expression changed at that. Not pity. Guilt. I shouldn't have mentioned it, she admitted quietly. A cold feeling settled into my stomach. Because suddenly I remembered another strange moment from years earlier. Tyler had been maybe 6 or 7 at the time. Daniel and Vanessa hosted a family barbecue in their backyard. I remembered standing beside the grill while Harold tossed hamburgers onto paper plates. Tyler had fallen off the swing set earlier that afternoon and scraped his knee badly. Vanessa panicked. Not normal mother panic. Real panic. I still remembered the way she grabbed Tyler's arm and rushed him inside before anyone could even look at the blood. At the time, I thought she was overprotective. Now the memory felt different. Sharper. Denise lowered her voice. They were at a genetics clinic in Hartford. She said carefully, I only recognized Tyler because I used to see him all the time when he was little. A genetics clinic. The words echoed heavily in my mind. I tried to keep my face neutral. Did she say why they were there? Denise shook her head immediately. No, and honestly, Margaret, I really shouldn't be talking about this. Of course she shouldn't. But the damage was already done. I drove home in silence afterward, barely remembering the roads between the grocery store and my house. The entire time, my mind kept replaying moments I had spent years ignoring. Tiny moments. Tiny lies. Tiny reactions. All adding up to something ugly. When Tyler was born, Vanessa refused to let the hospital take family photos for nearly 2 days. She claimed she looked exhausted. When Harold jokingly said Tyler had absolutely none of the Walker family nose, Vanessa snapped at him so harshly the whole room went quiet. Later she cried and accused everyone of criticizing her parenting. Daniel defended her, of course. He always did. I pulled into my driveway and sat there gripping the steering wheel long after turning off the engine. Rainwater dripped slowly from the gutters above the garage. Somewhere nearby, a lawnmower hummed in the distance. Normal sounds. Normal neighborhood. Normal life. That was the strange thing about family betrayal. It rarely begins with screaming. It begins quietly. Small enough to ignore. Until one day, you realize the silence itself was hiding something. Inside the house, I walked straight to the hallway closet and reached for the old photo albums Harold used to organize every Christmas. The cardboard box felt heavier than I remembered. Dust coated the edges. I carried it carefully to the dining table and opened the first album. There was Daniel at age 10 holding a baseball glove nearly bigger than his body. Daniel at 16 smiling beside his first car. Daniel on his wedding day standing beside Vanessa beneath white roses and expensive hotel lights. I turned another page slowly. Then stopped. Tyler's newborn photo stared back at me. Tiny blue knit cap. Closed eyes. Small clenched fists. And suddenly, for the first time in 16 years, I noticed something that made my chest tighten. The date. I leaned closer. Then reached for my reading glasses. Because according to the hospital bracelet in that photograph, Tyler had been born almost 2 months earlier than the timeline Vanessa always told the family. I sat at the dining table for nearly an hour staring at that photograph. The date on the hospital bracelet refused to make sense. Vanessa always claimed Tyler had been born early. 7 weeks early, to be exact. I remembered it clearly because she repeated that story constantly during his first few years. Every small childhood sickness became part of the premature baby narrative she told everyone. But according to the date in the album, the timeline didn't fit. Not even close. I slowly turned the page backward until I found the wedding photos again. Daniel and Vanessa had married in late October. Tyler's hospital bracelet showed a birth date that should have made the pregnancy impossible based on the story Vanessa gave the family. Unless. I leaned back in my chair and covered my mouth with my hand. No. I didn't want to think it. Not yet. Outside, the wind rattled softly against the kitchen windows while the old grandfather clock near the hallway ticked steadily through the silence. Harold used to say that when something was wrong in a family, people spent more energy protecting the lie than protecting each other. At the time, I thought he was talking about his brother's gambling problem. Now I wondered if he had noticed things I never did. I opened another photo album carefully. More pictures. More birthdays. More holidays. And suddenly the pattern became impossible to ignore. Vanessa hated conversations about family resemblance. Anytime someone mentioned Tyler's eyes, nose, smile, or personality, she redirected the conversation almost immediately. He looks like himself, she'd say sharply. Or, babies change. Or, not everything is genetic. At the time, those comments sounded harmless. Now they sounded rehearsed. My phone buzzed suddenly beside the photo albums. Vanessa. I stared at the screen for several seconds before answering. Hello? Her voice came quickly. Too quickly. Tyler told me you asked him if he wanted help setting up the DNA kit online. I stayed quiet. He's excited about it, I said calmly. Vanessa inhaled sharply. I don't want him doing it. There it was. Direct. Immediate. No pretending this time. I closed the photo album slowly. Why not? A long silence followed. Then, because I'm his mother. Not because it's unnecessary. Not because it's invasive. Just because I said so. I looked toward the kitchen window as leaves drifted across the backyard grass. You seem frightened by a simple ancestry test, I said softly. I'm not frightened. But her voice cracked slightly. And that tiny crack told me more than any confession could have. I lowered my voice. Does Daniel know something I don't? The silence that followed felt endless. Then Vanessa spoke again, colder this time. You're imagining things because you're lonely. That one landed exactly where she intended. Lonely. Old. Paranoid. For years, whenever I noticed something uncomfortable, Vanessa had a way of making me question myself instead. It was subtle. Careful. Almost elegant. And Daniel never noticed it happening. Or maybe he did. Maybe it was easier not to. I think, I said quietly, that people usually become defensive when they're afraid the truth might come out. Vanessa laughed once. Short. Nervous. You're going to damage this family over nothing. Damage this family. Not. You're wrong. Not. There's no secret. I closed my eyes slowly. Because deep down, I already knew something terrible had happened years ago. I just didn't know how far the lie actually went. After that phone call, I stopped trying to convince myself I was imagining things. For 2 years, I had treated my suspicions like something shameful. Like noticing the cracks in my family somehow made me disloyal. But Vanessa's reaction to that DNA kit wasn't normal. And neither was the fear in her voice. The next morning, I drove to the public records office downtown. The building smelled faintly of old paper and floor polish, exactly the same way it had 20 years ago when Harold helped Daniel file paperwork for his first business license. Back then, Daniel used to ask his father for advice about everything. Now I wasn't even sure my son knew the truth about his own family. A young clerk with bright red nails sat behind the counter typing lazily on her keyboard while country music played softly from a radio somewhere in the back office. Can I help you? She asked politely. I adjusted my glasses. I'm trying to request a copy of a birth record. She handed me a form without looking up. Immediate family only. I'm the grandmother. That finally got her attention. 20 minutes later, I walked out with shaking hands and a certified copy of Tyler's birth certificate sealed inside a plain manila envelope. I didn't open it in the parking lot. I couldn't. Instead, I drove to Harold's favorite lakeside park on the edge of town. The trees were almost bare now, orange and brown leaves scattered across the walking paths. We used to bring Daniel there every fall when he was little. I sat alone on a cold wooden bench overlooking the water and finally opened the envelope. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Tyler Walker. Mother, Vanessa Walker. Father, Daniel Walker. Normal. Clean. Official. But then I noticed the filing date. My stomach tightened immediately. The certificate had been amended nearly 11 months after Tyler's birth. Amended. I stared at the word for a long time. Most people probably wouldn't think twice about it. But I did. Because Daniel himself had once needed an amended birth certificate after Harold officially adopted him when he was 5 years old. I still remembered the paperwork. The court hearings. The legal signatures. Amended documents always meant one thing. Something had been changed. A cold breeze moved across the lake as I reached for my phone with trembling fingers. There was only one person left who might know the truth. Elaine Mercer. Harold's old attorney. She had handled our wills, trust documents, and family legal matters for almost 30 years before semi-retiring. More importantly, she knew Vanessa long before the wedding. Back when Vanessa briefly worked as a receptionist at Harold's accounting firm during college. Elaine answered on the third ring. Margaret, she said warmly. Goodness, it's been ages. I tried to keep my voice steady. Elaine, I need to ask you something unusual. An hour later, I was sitting across from her inside a quiet little cafe near Main Street while steam curled upward from untouched coffee cups between us. Elaine listened carefully without interrupting as I explained everything. The DNA kit. The timeline. The amended certificate. Vanessa's panic. When I finally finished speaking, Elaine became very still. That frightened me more than if she had argued. "You know something," I whispered. Elaine looked down at her coffee. Then slowly removed her reading glasses. "Margaret," she said quietly, "before you continue digging into this, you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that your son may not be the only person who was deceived." I felt the blood drain from my face. The cafe suddenly seemed too quiet. Outside the front window, people walked along Main Street carrying shopping bags and paper coffee cups like it was an ordinary Thursday afternoon. Maybe for them, it was. For me, everything had started shifting underneath my feet. Elaine folded her hands carefully on the table. "I need you to understand something first," she said softly. "I never had proof of anything." I nodded slowly. "But you suspected." She looked away for a moment before answering. "Yes." The word landed heavily between us. I stared down at the amended birth certificate still resting beside my purse. "When Tyler was born," Elaine continued carefully, "Harold asked me a strange question." A cold feeling moved through my chest. "What kind of question?" Elaine hesitated. "He asked how difficult it would be to legally protect inheritance assets if a child turned out not to be biologically connected to the family." I stopped breathing for a second. Harold. My husband. He had suspected something all those years ago. And he never told me. The waitress approached our table asking if we wanted refills. Neither of us answered right away. After she walked away, Elaine lowered her voice further. Harold noticed the timeline didn't make sense shortly after Tyler was born. I closed my eyes briefly. Of course he noticed. Harold had been an accountant for 40 years. Numbers, dates, details, he caught inconsistencies instinctively. He confronted Daniel privately once. Elaine said. I looked up immediately. What? Elaine nodded sadly. Daniel became very upset. He insisted Tyler was his son and accused Harold of trying to destroy his marriage. That sounded exactly like my son. Daniel hated conflict. Always had. Even as a child, he would rather believe an uncomfortable lie than face a painful truth directly. And Vanessa? I asked quietly. Elaine's expression tightened. She cried, said everyone was judging her, claimed stress from the premature birth was affecting her emotionally. The same strategy. Again and again. Tears. Deflection. Guilt. I suddenly remembered something else. About a year before Harold died, he started changing parts of our trust documents. At the time, he simply told me he wanted extra protection around family assets. I never questioned it. Now I wondered if he had been trying to protect Daniel all along. Or protect me. He didn't tell me, I whispered. Elaine's eyes softened. I think Harold hoped he was wrong. That hurt more than anything else. Because I understood that feeling perfectly now. Wanting the people you love to be innocent. Even when the evidence keeps growing. I stared out the cafe window while memories replayed one after another in my mind. Vanessa discouraging family photos. Vanessa refusing blood donation discussions after Tyler's bicycle accident years ago. Vanessa becoming furious anytime someone joked about Tyler resembling another side of the family. Every piece suddenly fit together too neatly. What if Daniel already knows? I asked quietly. Elaine didn't answer immediately. That silence told me enough. Oh my God, I whispered. She reached across the table and gently touched my hand. Margaret, sometimes people choose denial because the truth costs too much. I swallowed hard. For 16 years, Daniel had loved that boy as his son. Baseball games, school projects, camping trips, late-night homework help. Every memory real. every feeling real. And suddenly I realized the cruelest part of this entire situation. The lie wasn't only about biology anymore. It had become the foundation of the entire family. And if the truth finally came out, everything built on top of it might collapse too. I drove home from the cafe in complete silence. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that presses against your chest until breathing feels difficult. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sun had already started setting behind the trees. Long shadows stretched across the lawn Harold used to mow every Saturday morning without fail. For years after he died, I kept expecting to see him out there. Some habits of love never really disappear. Inside the house, I placed the amended birth certificate beside the photo albums on the dining room table and stood there staring at them for a long time. 16 years. 16 years of lies, suspicion, silence, and avoidance. And somehow, the person I felt most heartbroken for wasn't myself. It was Daniel. Because whether Tyler was biologically his son or not, my son had loved that boy completely. Nothing could erase that. I slowly removed my coat and walked into Harold's old study. The room still smelled faintly of cedarwood and coffee even after all this time. His framed accounting licenses hung neatly beside the bookshelf exactly where he left them. Harold believed paperwork mattered. Truth mattered. That's probably why he saw the cracks long before I did. I opened the bottom drawer of his desk carefully. Inside sat the thick blue binder containing our trust documents and estate paperwork. Harold updated everything a year before his death after one long private meeting with Elaine. At the time, he simply kissed my forehead afterward and said, "Just making sure you're protected." Now I finally understood what he meant. I carried the binder to the dining table and flipped through the pages slowly. Most of it was standard. Property distribution. Retirement accounts. Investment transfers. Then I found the clause. A separate inheritance trust tied specifically to biological lineage verification before future asset distribution to direct descendants. My hands went cold instantly. Harold knew. Maybe not everything. But enough. Enough to quietly prepare for the possibility that one day the truth would surface. I sat back heavily in my chair. For the first time since my birthday dinner, I stopped feeling confused and started feeling angry. Not loud anger. Not screaming anger. The kind that settles quietly into your bones after years of realizing you were manipulated slowly enough not to notice. Vanessa hadn't only lied. She had isolated me from my own family while protecting that lie. Every awkward holiday. Every cancelled visit. Every subtle humiliation. Every time she made me feel old, paranoid, intrusive, unwanted. It suddenly looked different now. Not random. Strategic. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was Tyler. "Hey Grandma, Mom says you're upset," with her sad face. I stared at the message for a long moment before typing back. "I'm not upset with anyone, sweetheart." 3 dots appeared immediately. Then, "Are we still doing the DNA thing? I think it sounds fun." I closed my eyes slowly. Poor child. He had no idea his entire world was balancing on top of secrets built by adults. After a moment, another message arrived. "Mom says those tests can mess families up." That one hit me hard. Because children usually repeat the fears they hear at home. I set the phone down carefully on the table. Then I looked again at Harold's trust binder. At the amended birth certificate. At 16 years of carefully managed silence. And finally, for the first time, I made a decision. I wasn't going to argue with Vanessa anymore. I wasn't going to beg Daniel to listen. And I wasn't going to reveal anything recklessly either. I was going to let the truth arrive on its own. Quietly. Legally. Permanently. Just the way Harold would have done it. Over the next 2 weeks, I said almost nothing to my family. That seemed to confuse Vanessa more than confrontation would have. I stopped asking questions. stopped mentioning the DNA kit, stopped reacting to her nervous little comments during phone calls. And the quieter I became, the more anxious she seemed. People who are hiding something often expect noise. Arguments, accusations, emotion. Silence unsettles them more, especially when they no longer know what you know. One Tuesday afternoon, Tyler came by after school while Daniel and Vanessa were both at work. He still did that sometimes despite Vanessa's efforts to limit our visits. Usually she preferred family time to happen only under her supervision. But Tyler had gotten his driver's permit recently, and independence arrives quickly at 16. I baked chocolate chip cookies that morning because Harold used to say difficult conversations always landed softer beside warm food. Tyler dropped his backpack by the kitchen island and grinned. "Grandma, your house always smells better than ours." I smiled faintly. "That's because I still use real butter." He laughed and grabbed 2 cookies before they'd fully cooled. For a few minutes, everything felt normal. Safe. Just a grandmother and her grandson talking about school, football practice, and college applications. Then Tyler suddenly looked toward the hallway to make sure we were alone. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." He hesitated. "Why does Mom hate those DNA tests so much?" I kept my expression calm even though my chest tightened immediately. "What makes you think she hates them?" Tyler shrugged awkwardly. "She got really upset after your birthday dinner." "Like, really upset?" He stared down at the cookie in his hands. "She and Dad fought about it afterward." That surprised me. Daniel and Vanessa almost never argued openly in front of Tyler. "What did they say?" I asked gently. Tyler shook his head. "I couldn't hear everything." He paused, but Dad kept asking why she was acting weird over something harmless. Interesting. Very interesting. Because that meant Daniel still didn't fully understand her reaction either. Tyler leaned back against the counter. "Honestly, I think those ancestry things are cool," he admitted. "I always wondered where our family came from." Our family. The words hurt more than they should have. Not because Tyler had done anything wrong. Because he was innocent inside a lie he never created. I poured him a glass of lemonade and tried to steady my thoughts. "Have you ever taken one before?" I asked casually. "Nope." He bit into another cookie. "Mom always says those companies steal people's information." That sounded exactly like Vanessa. Always another excuse. Another reason. Another distraction. Tyler suddenly frowned slightly. "Actually," he said slowly, "there was this weird thing a few years ago." I stayed very still. "What thing?" He shrugged. "When I was like 12, I needed blood work for soccer camp or something. Mom completely freaked out when the nurse asked Dad for family medical history." A cold feeling moved through me immediately. "What do you mean?" She answered every question for him. Tyler said. Dad looked confused the whole time. I stared quietly at the kitchen table. Another piece. Another crack in the story. Tyler finished his lemonade and stood to leave. At the front door, he hugged me tightly like he always had since he was little. "I'm glad you gave me that gift," he said with a smile. It actually made Mom act weird for once. I forced a soft laugh. But after he drove away, I stood alone at the window watching the empty street for a very long time. Because for the first time since this nightmare began, I realized the truth was already starting to surface on its own. 3 days later, the DNA results arrived. Not by mail. By email. I was sitting at my kitchen table early Saturday morning when the notification appeared on my laptop screen. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet except for the distant sound of someone blowing leaves across their driveway. For a moment, I just stared at the subject line. DNA results ready. My hands suddenly felt cold. I had told myself for weeks that I wanted answers. But the truth is, there's a difference between suspecting something and seeing it confirmed in black and white. I clicked the email slowly. The website loaded. A spinning circle. Then the results appeared. Probability of biological relationship between Daniel Walker and Tyler Walker, 0%. I stopped breathing. Not because I was shocked anymore. Because some small part of me had still hoped I was wrong. I closed my eyes and leaned back in my chair while the morning light stretched quietly across the kitchen floor. 16 years. 16 years of lies sitting at family dinner tables. 16 years of photographs, birthdays, Christmas mornings, and school graduations built on top of a secret only one person seemed determined to protect at all costs. Vanessa. My phone rang less than 2 minutes later. Her name flashed across the screen. Of course she knew. I answered calmly. "What have you done?" she whispered immediately. Not angry. Terrified. I looked again at the results page glowing softly on my laptop. "I didn't do anything, Vanessa," I said quietly. "The truth did." I heard uneven breathing on the other end. "Then, you had no right." That almost made me laugh. No right. After 16 years of manipulation, exclusion, lies, and emotional games, suddenly I was the one crossing boundaries. "You let my son raise another man's child without telling him," I said softly. "Don't lecture me about rights." She began crying instantly. Real tears this time. Not controlled ones. Panicked ones. "You don't understand," she whispered. "Then help me understand." Silence. Long enough for me to hear her trying to steady herself. Finally, she spoke again. "It was one mistake. One mistake." That phrase echoed through me like ice. Because children aren't mistakes. Affairs aren't mistakes. 16 years of deception isn't a mistake. It's a decision repeated every single day. "Does Daniel know?" I asked quietly. "No." The answer came too fast. I closed my eyes. Part of me felt relief for my son. Another part felt devastated for him. Because in many ways, this moment would destroy the version of his life he thought was real. "He deserves the truth," I said. Vanessa's voice hardened immediately. "If you tell him, you'll destroy this family." There it was again. That word. Family. As if family only mattered when protecting her secret. I stood slowly and walked toward the kitchen window overlooking Harold's old oak tree. "You already destroyed it," I whispered. She started sobbing harder now. Begging me not to say anything. Promising she loved Daniel. Promising Tyler only knew Daniel as his father. Promising it would ruin everyone's lives. And the terrible part was, she wasn't completely wrong. Because no matter what happened next, innocent people were going to get hurt. Especially Tyler. I pressed my fingers gently against the cold kitchen glass. Then I remembered something Harold once told me after Daniel's first heartbreak in high school. A painful truth heals eventually. A painful lie keeps spreading. Vanessa kept crying softly into the phone. But for the first time since this began, I noticed something strange inside myself. I wasn't afraid anymore. I didn't tell Daniel immediately. That surprised even me. For 2 days, I carried the truth around quietly like something fragile and dangerous in my chest. I barely slept. I barely ate. Every room in my house felt filled with memories that suddenly meant something different now. Harold had known. Vanessa had lied. And Daniel, my sweet, trusting boy, had built his entire adult life on top of a betrayal he never saw coming. Sunday evening, Daniel showed up at my house unexpectedly. Alone. The moment I opened the front door, I knew something had changed. He looked exhausted. Not physically. Emotionally. Like someone who had spent hours trying to solve a puzzle that refused to fit together. "Can I come in?" he asked quietly. I stepped aside without a word. Rain tapped softly against the windows while Daniel stood awkwardly in the middle of my living room staring at the old family photographs above the fireplace. Pictures of birthdays, vacations, Tyler's Little League games. Harold smiling beside all of us before cancer hollowed his face during those last difficult months. I talked to Vanessa, Daniel finally said. I sat down slowly in Harold's armchair. And? Daniel rubbed both hands over his face. At first she said you were paranoid. He laughed bitterly. Then she started crying. That sounded familiar. She admitted there was someone else. He whispered. The room suddenly felt very still. But she swears she doesn't know for sure whether Tyler is mine. I closed my eyes briefly. That lie again. Smaller now. Weaker now. But still alive. Daniel stared at the floor. You already knew, didn't you? I answered honestly. I suspected. The silence between us hurt more than shouting ever could have. Finally, Daniel sat down across from me and looked older than I had ever seen him. When Dad questioned the timeline years ago, he said slowly, I thought he was insulting my marriage. So Harold really had confronted him. Daniel swallowed hard. I chose to believe her. Not because the evidence made sense. Not because the dates worked. Because he loved her. That was the cruel thing about betrayal. The kindest people usually make the easiest targets. I found the DNA results in her email trash folder this morning. Daniel whispered. My heart tightened instantly. He already knew. Completely. She took the test herself after your birthday dinner. He continued, before Tyler even mailed his. I stared at him carefully. And? Daniel's eyes filled with tears he was trying desperately to control. He's not mine. The words barely came out. For a moment, neither of us moved. Outside, headlights swept briefly across the wet street before disappearing into the dark. I keep thinking about all the times she looked me in the eye. Daniel whispered, all the times I defended her. I wanted to comfort him. But there are some kinds of pain a mother cannot remove from her child no matter how badly she wants to. She said it only happened once. He added bitterly. I almost smiled sadly at that. As if betrayal becomes smaller when people repeat that sentence enough times. Daniel looked around the room slowly. You know what hurts the most? I waited quietly. She spent years convincing me you were the problem. That one hit hard. Because it was true. Every family dinner. Every awkward silence. Every cancelled visit. Vanessa had slowly positioned me as the difficult one so nobody would look too closely at her instead. Daniel wiped his eyes quickly and stood. I asked her to leave tonight. I looked up sharply. She took Tyler to her sister's house. The house suddenly felt colder. Broken. But somewhere underneath the heartbreak, another feeling slowly surfaced too. Not victory. Just clarity. Because after 16 years of lies, the truth had finally entered the room. The weeks after Daniel asked Vanessa to leave felt strangely quiet. Not peaceful. Not painful either. Just different. Like a house after a storm finally passes, when the air still smells like rain and broken branches, but the wind has finally stopped screaming. Daniel moved slowly through those first days. I could see it in his face every time he came by the house. The exhaustion. The humiliation. The grief. Not only for his marriage, but for the life he thought he had. One afternoon in early November, he sat across from me at the kitchen table while I peeled apples for a pie. The same pie Harold used to request every Thanksgiving. Daniel stared silently into his coffee for a long time before speaking. I keep wondering if Tyler will hate me someday, he admitted quietly. I set the knife down gently. Why would he? Daniel laughed bitterly. Because I'm not really his father. I looked directly at my son. Biology matters, I said softly, but love matters too. His eyes filled immediately. Because deep down, he already knew the truth. No DNA result could erase 16 years of bedtime stories. Football games, science projects, scraped knees, birthday candles, and late-night conversations between a father and a son. Those things were real, even if the lie surrounding them wasn't. A few days later, Tyler came to see me alone. He looked older somehow. Not physically. Emotionally. Teenagers grow up quickly once they realize adults are flawed. I know, he said quietly the moment I opened the door. I didn't pretend to misunderstand. He stepped inside slowly, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his hoodie. Mom finally told me everything. I nodded gently and led him into the kitchen. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then Tyler looked up at me with red, exhausted eyes. Am I still part of this family? That question nearly broke me. I reached across the table and held his hand tightly. Tyler, I whispered, you were part of this family the moment your father loved you. His lip trembled slightly. You still call him my father. Because he is. And I meant it. Blood can reveal secrets. But it cannot measure loyalty. Or love. Or the years someone spends showing up for you every single day. Tyler started crying quietly after that. Not loudly. Just enough to finally let the hurt out. And for the first time in years, I realized something important. The truth hadn't destroyed my family. The lies had. Truth had simply ended the pretending. By Christmas, Daniel had officially filed for divorce. Vanessa moved out of town shortly afterward to live near her sister. I never tried to contact her again. Not out of hatred. Just acceptance. Some people spend so much time protecting their secrets that eventually there's nothing real left underneath them. Daniel and Tyler still came to my house every Sunday after that. Sometimes we watched football. Sometimes we cooked dinner together. Sometimes we simply sat quietly in the living room Harold once filled with laughter. And slowly, painfully, life began rebuilding itself into something more honest. Smaller. But honest. A few nights ago, Tyler helped me decorate the Christmas tree. Halfway through entangling the lights, he suddenly smiled and said, you know, Grandma, that DNA kit really changed everything. I looked at him standing beneath the soft glow of the tree lights and smiled back gently. Yes, I said quietly. It finally did.